Welcome to OrcaBoats. Today we're installing the gunnels on PT11. So because CNC uses generally a round cutting bit, it cannot make perfect 90-degree angles. So for this outwale to fit into this slot, we're just going to have to make a small modification, tidy it up a little bit, so that it does. And that, first off, is just taking a sanding block and squaring off that bottom corner. And also, because there's a radius on the outer edge, we're going to sand off a little bit of the outer profile of the plywood, round it a little bit, and then we just sort of check to see that this will sit in the bottom and come in to the end nicely here. And we'll just keep working on it until it does. Now that I have the bow tips sanded and fit nicely at the bow end, just going to clamp both gunnels in place as a dry fit. I like to just put these parts in place with my quick grips, although I don't find they really have a good tight hold. They're good for one-handed work when you're working by yourself. But I'm now going to go back and clamp it a little bit tighter in place with my 2-inch C-clamps. If you didn't have enough C-clamps to do both sides, I suppose you could just do one side, or even if you only had a very few clamps, you could clamp a small area, set your screws in from the inside, and then move on to another section. But since I have enough clamps, I'm just using the quick grips to hold it in place for me. It's kind of like a second hand, and then adding my C-clamps. Now that I have both of the gunnels in place, I'm just going to tap here and there to move the gunnels so that the top surface is perfectly flush with the shear strake. And once I've got that, I can now begin to set my screws with little backing blocks in all of the pre-drilled holes to hold the gunnel in place. And I'm just using 1-inch drywall screws that are through a small 1-inch by 1-inch plywood block with a hole drilled in it, and that's basically used as a washer, which basically prevents the head of the screw from being driven into the plywood panel. So now that I have the two outwales nicely dry fitted exactly where we're going to permanently install them, I'm just going to put a few runs of masking tape under on the shear strake panel just to prevent squeeze out, which is eventually going to happen from being spread everywhere all over the shear strake panel. Once there's epoxy all over the outwales, they're going to become very slippery and a little bit difficult to manage. So these little blocks of scrap plywood are just hot glued under the outwale in about 3 places per side. That will help to hold the gunnel in place before setting the screws in. So now I'm just going to make a few marks, little reference lines, so that I can put the gunnel back in the same location. So once the dry fit is complete and everything is where we want it, it's time to just back out the screws and take the outwales off, prepare them for gluing them on. And the first step in gluing the outwells on, I am just brushing on some unthickened epoxy. And here I'm using West System 105 and 207 slow hardener. Normally I would use 205 fast hardener, but this is a bit of a larger project, so I'm going to need a little more time, and I don't want epoxy kicking off before I can actually get the outwell back in place. After brushing the epoxy onto the inside faces of both of the outwells, I will come back and do a second coat, since the edging of the plywood tends to suck up a little more epoxy and I don't want a dry joint. And then I brush a little epoxy onto the mating surface of the hull panel. Now the plywood here doesn't really absorb that much epoxy, but again, we don't want to be having epoxy sucked out of the joint and causing it to fail. I have now taken the remaining epoxy and thickened it up with 2 parts silica and 1 part filleting blend from West System, and it's mixed up to basically the consistency of thick peanut butter, and then I'm just spreading it on to the inside surfaces of all the gunnels. You can spread it in a bit of a lumps here or just dab it on with the brush to get enough onto there so that the gap will be filled. And once I have enough thickened epoxy on the inner surfaces of the gunnels, I'm just going to go back with the brush and just kind of run it along and just sort of smooth it out so there's not heavy in one area and thin as in others. And with enough epoxy spread onto the gunnels, I'm just going to bring them back to the boat, lay them on the little ledges that were hot glued onto the sides, move my gunnel fore or aft so that my reference marks nicely line up, and just clamp it in place with my quick grips prior to setting the screws back in. With the thickened epoxy between the gunnels and the boat itself, you really want to be careful that these screws that are going to be set in there are not actually set in epoxy and get stuck in there. So just sprayed them with some WD-40 on a rag and wiped them all around, and now I can just use those screws and reset. The screws will just find the same hole that was in there on the dry fit. And at the bow end, to make sure that the two tips come together nicely and level, I've just put a small block under and a block on top, and then just clamping them together and looking carefully to make sure that they are coming together evenly and level. I don't want my little ledge blocks to be permanently glued in there with any squeeze out epoxy, so we can just knock those right off right away. And then begin to use a small chisel stick to wipe off all of the squeeze out epoxy. This would be very difficult to get in there and clean that thickened epoxy out if we just let it harden there. So it's extremely important to clean up this now prior to it hardening. On the top surface, as you can see, it's pretty easy, just running the chisel stick along the surface, cleaning it off in a rag, and it does a great job of making sure we don't have... Okay, time to take the screws out. Hopefully they don't break off. That's why we sprayed a little WD-40 on there, just so that none of these screws get seriously set in epoxy. Because if they break off, We ain't getting them out. And it doesn't take much for a little epoxy on your fingers to just get on the back of the blocks, almost attached to the boat. But as luck would have it, there you go. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to follow this build and other projects at OrcaBoats.